Okay, hey everybody, here we are. This is Mike L. We're at Detroit Comics for the latest episode of the Comic Book Syndicate. We're here with our pal Brian Kelly,
Hot dog,
everyone's favorite Syrian refugee.
Right?
And this is
no kidding.
This is Jeff Chapman, our pal from the Nerdy Book Club.
Yes.
And we are here to review The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, and Lynn Varley, which is one of the inspirations for the film Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. So, we just reread this comic, but before we get into the full review...
Was it 30 years later?
30 years later, yeah.
Oh my God.
Basically, let's talk about the conception of this comic. Now, at the time that this was published, Frank Miller was already making a name for himself in the industry. He had written and drawn Daredevil for a few years. He had done a book called Ronin for DC. So he was already a popular artist. With this, he became a superstar.
He was the Garth Ennis of his day.
You could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, he kind of said that I think he turned 30. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was older than the comic book version of Batman. So he kind of got this idea, I think I'm going to do a story of Batman as an adult, and this is what he came up with. Now, it also happened to come out the same year. It sort of overlapped the same time as Watchmen, which was a very similar execution of Alan Moore's version of the Charlton Heroes. It also came out the same year as Mouse, which we're going to talk about. Let's talk about the impact that this comic had when it came out. Now, between the three of us, Brian, I think you were the only one that read it when it was first published, right?
'Cause I'm
and what was your
old.
impression of it?
I'm old. So I am, at this time, I'm like 15. I'm going to Comics Corner in Fraser. I'm picking it up, and I'm kind of getting in on it late because I'm hearing it from other people that I talk to secondary, and I'm like, it's good. It just didn't. Maybe it was my mindset at the time, but I really didn't take it as something changing, as something monumentally different. I mean, I saw it as, wow, this is interesting. The layouts are weird, the coloring is strange, and the art is totally weird. But at the time, I was like, okay, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was around at that time, and that was, that was very different as well. There were Animal comics that were around at that time. I just really, and Watchmen, obviously.
And what were you reading at the time,
God.
mainly?
Amazing Spider-Man was my big thing. Captain America.
I mean, that's what I was reading. I was reading a lot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and X-Men and the Claremont days of X-Men.
Yep.
I was really into that. I didn't read this at the time, and I didn't read Watchmen at the time. And I'm always interested because I hear people who talk about the experience of reading Watchmen as it came out, or the experience of reading this, right? Like it seems like it would be a totally different thing because I think it sort of turned a lot of what was happening before it on its head and said kind of, we're not doing what we used to do. Yeah. And I think reading it at the time must have, in some ways, if you weren't Brian, been mind-boggling.
Well, for me, I came in and read this a couple years after it was published, but for me, obviously, Frank Miller went on to do a story called Batman Year One, which was really going back and redoing the origin of Batman, which he did with David Mazzucchelli. And I think that book actually holds up much better than this one.
Totally.
It does, yeah. Most
Such a
people
good
think
book.
so. But this one definitely had more impact as far as affecting Batman as a character. And I think that it's safe to say that there's no bigger before and after in Batman's publishing history as before Dark Knight and after. Frank Miller really changed the way the character was portrayed. Like this not only affected Batman, it affected everything. Everyone tried to imitate this.
Yes.
Keith Giffen imitated it. Todd McFarlane imitated it in Spawn.
I think that's super interesting in terms of the history of comics because 86 is right at the beginning point of the shift of readership from youth to adult, but also the moment when people started thinking that this is how I'm going to get rich by buying all the comics and saving them and putting them in plastic, and so the publishers, I think, started publishing towards adults, collectors and adults, and away from kids, and that ultimately then probably started a 10-year cycle that ended with the collapse of the comic book shop.
Yeah. Unfortunately, 93. This also directly led to the Tim Burton film starring Michael Keaton. This treatment of Batman directly affected Batman's popularity, and which led to the 1989 film, which was another cultural phenomenon.
I want to say, once people read this book, once people started reading this book, it was a slow burn. You started to see people started taking Batman in a whole new direction. It was not necessarily campy. The Jim Aparo Batman at the time was fine. it got a little darker tone.
This is really, I mean, Alan Moore had done Miracle Man, and he'd already done Swamp Thing, which was really the beginning of this whole trend. And Frank Miller had done Daredevil, but I think the reason this was so important because now it was Batman. Now it was a household name that was being given this adult treatment.
Were there many anti-heroes before this? Like, was the dark hero a thing? Because
there was Punisher and there was Wolverine.
Yes.
Maybe.
He became huge around this time.
Yeah, because I think it was a year or two before this was the Wolverine miniseries by Chris Claremont and Frank Miller again. So this was the time for this type of hero, but this was really the biggest one, I think. This was the biggest book. So when we come back, we are going to talk about the art and the story, the actual comic itself. Does it still hold up 30 years later? Right after this.
The Comic Book Syndicate will be back right after this.